Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Sherlockian interview. Today, we're talking to Susan Knight, who's the author of Mrs Hudson Investigates. Hi, Susan.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. And you're dialing in from quite close by, I think.
I'm from Dublin, yes, Dublin. A beautiful
Fantastic.
morning in Dublin.
Yeah, it's really nice to be able to do an interview where we're on the same time zone. Most of the time, I have to kind of calculate between here and the US, where most of the Sherlockian authors live. So it's
Mhm.
great to be talking to somebody from Dublin. Let's start with how you came across Sherlock Holmes.
Well, it seems to me that I've always been reading Sherlock Holmes, dipping into him. I imagine that the first one I probably read was The Hound of the Baskervilles, and then went on from there. But I couldn't actually pinpoint a moment where Sherlock Holmes came into my consciousness because, well, I've been around a long time anyway. So I think I've always been pretty aware of him and a fan.
Fantastic. And your book, Mrs Hudson's Investigates, comes out next month.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about Mrs Hudson Investigates and why you chose her as the central character.
Well, I've always liked taking a side. I thought it was always very interesting to take a minor character from a story and put them center stage. I think that goes back to the time I first saw Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard, where he takes the two courtiers in the Hamlet play, and they're the main characters, and Hamlet is a bit part. So I've always thought it's very interesting to see someone else's perspective. And because Mrs. Hudson is a woman and that she has a particular feminine perspective on things, I thought it would be very interesting to examine how she might conduct some investigations of her own. It's the story. She actually launches in by chance into this because Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are away, and a distraught young woman arrives at Baker Street to get help. And because they're away, and because Mrs. Hudson has learnt a few clever tips of deduction from her lodger, the young woman begs her to accompany her back to where she lives to give her some help. And Mrs. Hudson initially is very reluctant to do this, but she decides she will. And so her investigations start there. And what she does is she brings a particularly feminine approach because unlike Sherlock, she can nip into the kitchen and chat to the staff, and they trust her because she's one of them, really. And also distraught young women like Beatrice Trueblood in the first story, they can confide in her with confidence because she's a motherly woman who understands what they're talking about. So it was great fun to write the stories. I take her all over the country on her adventures, and I hope that people will enjoy reading about them.
Fantastic. And as you said, it's a collection of short stories. And this isn't our first Mrs. Hudson focused book. I know we've introduced you to Barry Brown and Wendy. This is a very different take from these two. I know you really enjoyed both of these books. Tell us
Yes, yes.
how these differ from yours.
Well, first of all, I should say that when I started the Mrs. Hudson stories, I thought I was being incredibly original. And excuse me, and it came as a bit of a surprise to find that so many other people had this a similar idea. But Barry Brown's Mrs. Hudson is very different from mine. She's the actual brains behind the secret brains behind the enterprise, and where Sherlock is a rather foolish gentleman, but he gives a lovely, he presents a lovely face to the detective agency that she runs. But she lurks in the background, solving all the mysteries. So it's quite different from mine because my Mrs. Hudson is actually quite patronized by Dr. Watson when she asks him, will he write up her stories? he just laughs and pats her on the head. So she has to go off and do it by herself. So it's quite a different angle to take. So that was very interesting. And then, of course, Wendy has the wonderful Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen with research into all the things, rather horrible things sometimes, that people ate in those days. So that was another aspect. My Mrs. Hudson is also a very good cook, by the way, and she makes rather she makes rather disparaging remarks sometimes about other people's cooking. So, but and she helps out too in the kitchen in some of the stories.
Fantastic.
So,
That's a great summary of those two books. Barry, I know Barry's takes a bit of flack for the fact that he's got Mrs. Hudson as the brains behind everything, and his are novels. Yours are short stories as well. So
yes,
that's
yes.
a very big difference. I think he's got 5 in the series so far. Very, very popular, and also now translated into Italian as well.
Oh, lovely.
Mondadori. But Wendy's book is fantastic because it's part cookbook, but also part behind the scenes kind of expose of living with Holmes and Watson while they're having their adventures. You've got your book launch coming up. It sounds like a beautiful venue. I've been looking at pictures on the web of the Teachers Club. Tell us a bit about the launch and who's going to be there.
Yes. Well, it is a beautiful building. It's in the Georgian Square in Dublin, the centre of Dublin, and they used to be the homes of the very rich. And then in the 18th, at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, all the rich people moved out and went to the suburbs. But these beautiful houses remain, and they've done a wonderful job of restoration on the Teachers Club. It's going to take place on the 7th of November, and I've managed to get the participation of Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson themselves to come along and launch the book for Mrs. Hudson, because the People's College where I teach, they have a drama group, and I had a chat with the director of the drama group, and he's got 2 of the actors to come along to do that. So that should be great fun on the night.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. And people can come along from 6:30 in the evening and meet Sherlock Holmes fans, see the amazing building, and of course get signed copies of Mrs. Hudson's Investigates on the night.
Yes, yes.
Fantastic. And you've got your Amazon author profile set up on the US and on the UK as well. You've published many other books, non-fiction and other types of fiction. And you've got a wonderful blog, which has some great articles about Holmes. I encourage people to check that out. What's next on the agenda for you, Susan?
Well, I'm still thinking, well, excuse me. I'm still thinking in terms of Mrs. Hudson. I have written a Victorian murder mystery set in Dublin. That's not a Holmesian story. That was great fun to research because I do like to, I was thinking about Wendy's book, that she did a lot of research to get it accurate, and I think that's very important to making people believe in the time and place you're writing about. So with the Victorian murder mystery, the Raven's Curse that I've written, I went to newspapers, I went all over the place looking for material for that, and set at the 1897, a time of Queen Victoria's Jubilee. One of the other books I read in the canon was set in that year as well, so I was quite interested in that, but that's set in London. But my idea for, I'm thinking I might attempt a Mrs. Hudson novel in which she comes to Ireland with one of her friends who is Irish. I've already mentioned Mrs. Melrose in one of the stories, who is an Irish woman married to an Englishman living in London. But I thought maybe I could inveigle Mrs. Hudson to accompany Mrs. Melrose over to Ireland and have an adventure there. But that's just a glint in my eye at the moment. So we'll see how that develops.
Well, that's how all of these wonderful stories start. They start as a glint, they turn into an idea. And one of the traditions we often have is, if you visit Undershaw, the former home of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, where we had an event last weekend, if you ever visit there, sit at Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's desk and write the first line of that book, and I guarantee you it will give you the inspiration.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
David Markham, Ben Cardle, Paul Hiscott, many have followed that tradition and are writing their books as we speak. So it's been a delight to talk to you, Susan, and I'm really looking forward to the launch of the book. It's Mrs Hudson Investigates, and it's out on the 7th of November.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve.